Usually when we talk about a building collapsing, there is this expectation of a single catastrophic event.
Right, like a demolition.
Yeah, exactly. You see the wrecking ball swing, you hear the impact, the massive cloud of dust billows out, and the structural engineer on site just points and says, yep, there it goes. That was the fatal blow.
It's a sudden external shock. It's definitive, it's visible, and completely undeniable.
And it is comforting in a weird psychological way. I mean, we like our history and our disasters to be clear-cut. We like simple cause and effect.
We really do.
Yeah.
But then, you look at massive historical structures, like the early modern superpower.
The sprawling empires that spanned continents.
Right. And suddenly that simple wrecking ball theory just, it doesn't hold up at all. When we look at how these massive entities fail, we're looking at a structural failure that is incredibly complex.
It's murky.
Yeah. Very murky. It's a slow motion unraveling.
It is the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters. And that is exactly what we are wading into today. So welcome to today's deep dive. We are taking a journey into the underlying mechanics of empires.
The big ones.
The really big ones. We want to figure out how they manage impossibly diverse populations, how they fund these massive, almost incomprehensible expansions across the globe, and, ultimately how they completely collapse.
Because the story of how an invincible empire eventually falls to internal warlords, foreign plunderers, and perhaps most shockingly, a multinational corporation. Well, it's one of the most fascinating diagnostic puzzles in history.
It really is the ultimate cold case. And to decode the blueprint of these early modern superpowers, we have been digging through a truly fascinating stack of research for you.
A really great stack today.
Yeah, we're pulling insights from a deeply researched academic paper published in the Pakistan Journal of History and Civilization. And it does this brilliant side-by-side comparison of religious tolerance in the Mughal and Ottoman empires.
Which is such a fascinating angle.
It really is. And we are combining that with a comprehensive historical overview that tracks the granular details of the Mughal Empire's decline, the specific wars, the rebellions, the sheer unadulterated chaos of it all.
Chaos is definitely the right word for it.
And to tie it all together, we have this wonderful tribute of Festschrift, which is a collection of scholarly essays. It's dedicated to the late, great historian, Professor John F. Richards.
And John F. Richards' work is absolutely foundational for what we are exploring today. I mean, before his groundbreaking research, the way historians looked at Mughal state building, their environmental history, and how they connected to global trade was entirely different.
He kind of flipped the script, didn't he?
He completely redefined the paradigm, yeah.
Okay, let's unpack this. Imagine you are a ruler in the 16th or 17th century. The sheer scale of the Mughal and Ottoman empires at this time is staggering.
We are talking about vast swaths of the globe.
Exactly. You are governing millions upon millions of subjects. You possess immense, practically incalculable wealth. But here is the central mystery. How do you actually govern millions of people who do not share your religion, do not share your culture, and do not speak your language?
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, while we are talking about centuries-old history today, the core theme of this deep dive is incredibly relevant to you right now.
Oh, absolutely.
Fundamentally, this is about how large, complex organizations operate. Whether you're looking at a modern nation-state, a sprawling global corporation, or an international institution, the challenges are identical.
Yeah, how do you manage intense diversity?
Right. How do you balance local autonomy, letting the regional branches do their own thing with strict centralized control? And how do you navigate the fatal risks of overexpansion?
The lessons are completely timeless.
Yeah.
So let's start with that initial problem of managing diversity. If you are the Ottoman Sultan or the Mughal Emperor, and you have just conquered this massive, highly pluralistic population, how do you stop them from revolting the very next day?
It's a huge logistical nightmare.
It is. The Pakistan Journal article points out that both of these were Islamic polities ruling over majorities or very significant minorities of non-Muslims. You cannot just keep a sword to everyone's neck forever.
No, force alone is way too expensive.
And completely unsustainable.
Right. You cannot garrison every single village. You need a system. Specifically, you need a negotiated system.
A negotiated system, I like that.
And the bedrock of that system in both the Ottoman and Mughal empires was legal pluralism. They didn't try to force everyone into one single, rigid legal box.
Which seems counterintuitive if you're an absolute monarch, right? You'd think they would want one law for everyone.
You'd think so. But instead, both empires utilized a dual legal system. On one hand, you had Sharia, which is Islamic religious law.
Right.
This was absolutely vital because it provided the rulers with their religious legitimacy in the eyes of their own elite and the wider Islamic world. But on the other hand, you had Qanun, which were imperial or sultanic decrees.
I want to pause on Qanun because that feels like the real secret sauce here.
It was. Qanun gave the state the administrative flexibility it needed to actually run an empire.
Because Sharia doesn't cover everything.
Exactly. Sharia is comprehensive, but it doesn't necessarily cover the minutiae of 16th century imperial taxation rates, or the specifics of newly conquered land tenure, or, the exact administrative hierarchy of a sprawling bureaucracy. Qanun filled those gaps.
I was reading about this dual system and trying to map it onto something modern. It feels a bit like the relationship between constitutional law and executive orders.
That's a good way to look at it.
Or maybe federal versus local state laws. But my immediate thought was, wouldn't this create absolute unmitigated chaos?
How so?
Well, say you are in a bustling market town in the 17th century. A Muslim merchant and a Hindu grain supplier have a massive commercial dispute. Or two neighboring farmers, one Muslim and one Christian, are arguing over a land boundary. Whose law wins? Who actually decides?
This raises an important question, and it gets right to the heart of why these empires lasted as long as they did. It is where the brilliance of their institutional design really shines.
Yeah, okay, lay it on you.
The Pakistan Journal piece goes to great lengths to clarify that these mixed jurisdictions were not chaotic at all. They were carefully negotiated out of pragmatic necessity.
So they weren't constantly fighting over jurisdiction.
No, the rulers did not see Sharia and Qanun as rivals locked in a zero-sum game. They viewed them as complementary tools in a massive toolbox. But the two empires did approach the actual application of these tools slightly differently.
Okay, let's look at the Ottoman approach first. How did they handle the overlap?
The Ottomans leaned very heavily into formal codification. They loved writing things down into massive standardized frameworks.
The big legal encyclopedias.
Sort of, yeah. They created what were called qanunams. These were comprehensive, written imperial law codes that organized the sultan's decrees. So you had the religious jurists handling family and religious law, but the sultan's codified decrees had binding power over the administration of the empire.
But the Mughals, they inherit this incredibly complex Indo-Islamic legal mosaic. I mean, India is massive, deeply diverse, with centuries of embedded caste and village laws.
Very different landscape.
Yeah, they can't just slap a giant rule book on it, can they?
Exactly, they couldn't, and they didn't try to. The Mughals balanced Sharia with their own imperial edicts, but they were much more fluid.
Fluid how?
They relied heavily on customary law. They essentially allowed village panchayats, which were local caste or village councils, to rule themselves when it came to agrarian contracts, local trade disputes, or familial issues.
That's fascinating.
The Mughal state basically said, as long as you pay your taxes and do not challenge the emperor's ultimate sovereignty, your local council can resolve your local disputes using your traditional customs.
It is almost like a form of extreme decentralization at the micro level, just to maintain peace at the macro level.
That's exactly what it was.
But you can't just let everyone do whatever they want. You have to structure this autonomy. And that brings us to the differing frameworks they use to actually manage these non-Muslim populations.
Right, the big structural systems.
The Ottomans use what is called the millet system, and the Mughals champion a concept called sulikul. Let's break down the millet system first.
The millet system was a masterpiece of corporatist organization. The Ottomans basically organized their minority populations, like the Christians and the Jews, into officially recognized autonomous corporate communities.
And these were the millets.
Yes, these were the millets. And each millet had its own officially recognized religious hierarchy. So you had the Greek Orthodox Patriarch in Constantinople, you had the Armenian Patriarch, you had the chief rabbi for the Jewish community.
And from what I understand, the Ottoman state essentially outsourced local governance to these religious leaders.
They did.
The sources mention that these millets handled all of their own personal law: marriage, divorce, inheritance, education, worship. The central government didn't touch it. It was entirely handled by the millet's internal courts.
Precisely. Think of it from the perspective of state capacity. The Ottoman administration did not have the manpower, or really the desire, to micromanage the daily lives of millions of Christian and Jewish subjects.
Why bother if they can manage themselves, right?
Right. By outsourcing this to the millets, they massively reduced the administrative burden on the state. But crucially, They made the leaders of these millets responsible for collecting taxes from their communities.
Ah, there it is.
Yeah, and remitting those taxes directly to the Ottoman treasury.
So it's almost like corporate franchising.
Franchising. Okay, let's hear this.
The Ottoman Empire is the parent company. They say to the Greek Orthodox Patriarch, you are the regional manager. You run the franchise however you want, using your own internal employee handbook. But at the end of the quarter, you owe us the franchise fee in full. If you deliver the fee, we protect your right to operate.
Franchising is a very helpful way to visualize it, actually. But it goes deeper than just financial remittance. It is about structural load-bearing and social welfare.
Social welfare in the 16th century.
Yes. A huge part of how these communities sustain themselves was through the WAC economy.
Let's slow down and define that, because the WAF comes up a lot in the sources. What exactly is a WAC, and how does it work?
A WAC is an inalienable pious endowment under Islamic law. It works like this. A wealthy individual donates a revenue-producing asset, say, a massive tract of fertile farmland, or a block of lucrative shops in a bazaar.
Okay, so they give away the property.
The physical asset cannot be sold or transferred, but the revenue generated from that asset, the rent, the crop yields, is permanently dedicated to funding a charitable cause.
Like a modern trust fund, but specifically for public works.
Exactly like a modern trust fund. The revenue from a WACS would underwrite the construction and perpetual maintenance of schools, hospitals, orphanages, and soup kitchens.
That's incredible.
And because it was a pious endowment, it was generally exempt from state taxation. Now, here is why this matters for our discussion of tolerance. The Ottomans did not just restrict this to Islamic endowments.
Wait, really? They let the millets do it too?
Yes. Christian and Jewish communities were allowed to establish their own parallel foundations, recognized and protected by the state.
That is brilliant. It means the minority communities have their own internally funded welfare system.
Exactly.
The state doesn't have to pay to build a hospital in a predominantly Christian neighborhood because the local Christian endowment is already funding it.
It creates socio-economic independence,
which keeps the population content while keeping the state's budget focused on the military and administration.
It creates a deeply embedded equilibrium. Now let's look at the Mughal side, because Emperor Akbar, ruling in the late 16th century, takes a very different and frankly much more radical route.
Akbar is a fascinating figure. He institutionalizes this concept called sulikul, which translates roughly to universal peace or absolute peace.
It's a beautiful concept.
It is, but the source makes it clear this wasn't just a dry legal framework. It was an entire cosmological and cosmopolitan court culture. The Pakistan Journal highlights some moves Akbar made that were stunning for the 1560s. Like in 1564, he completely abolishes the jizya.
And we should clarify, the jizya was the traditional Islamic head tax levied on adult, non-Muslim males living under a Muslim ruler.
Right.
It was an established, centuries-old practice designed to show submission and, in return, guarantee state protection.
Right, and it was a massive source of revenue, but Akbar just scraps it. He also abolishes the pilgrimage tax that was levied on Hindus visiting their sacred sites. Why give up all that money?
Because Akbar realized that to truly integrate the Rajput warrior classes and the vast Hindu peasantry into a loyal imperial structure, he had to remove the financial penalties of their faith.
It's a huge investment in loyalty.
What's fascinating here is that Akbar is signaling a profound courtly ecumenism. He is actively trying to weave plural norms into the very fabric of imperial rule. He's transitioning the empire from a conquering Muslim army into an indigenous Indian state.
Which is a massive shift in identity.
Huge. He started issuing Farman's formal royal orders to explicitly protect Hindu and Jain temple endowments.
There is a detail in the Pakistan Journal article that I think is incredibly helpful for visualizing the difference between the Ottomans and the Mughals on this front.
The tolerance index.
Yes. The authors created a heuristic index, a 0 to 10 scale graph, to measure tolerance across different domains. It is not about hard quantitative math, obviously. You can't calculate a numerical value for empathy.
Right, it's illustrative.
But it is a way of visualizing the qualitative structural differences in their policies. And under the specific category of cultural patronage and interfaith diplomacy, the Ottomans score an 8, which is very high. But the Mughals score a 9 out of 10.
That 1-point difference is actually a massive chasm in how the state operated ideologically.
How so?
Well, the Ottomans tolerated differences. They gave you your millet and left you alone. But the Mughal court, under Akbar, actively patronized and valorized it.
They celebrated it.
Exactly. Akbar created translation bureaus called the Maktab Khana, specifically to translate massive Sanskrit epics like the Mahabharata and the Ramayana into Persian, so the Muslim nobility could read them.
And he held those famous midnight debates.
Oh, the Ibadat Khana.
Yeah, he built the Ibadat Khana, the house of worship, and he would host Jesuit priests from Europe, Jain scholars, Sufi mystics, Zoroastrian fire worshippers, and Hindu Brahmins. He would have them debate theology in front of him.
It's wild to think about.
You don't get a 9 out of 10 just for not taxing people. You get it for actively trying to build a shared, blended intellectual culture.
Precisely. But, both of these empires, as brilliant as their philosophies might have been, were ultimately pragmatic machines.
Right, they had to run the business.
They knew that you can host all the poetry readings and theological debates you want, but to really make a sprawling empire stick together, you need to bring minority elites into the actual functional machinery of the state. You need elite incorporation.
If they don't have skin in the game, they have no reason to support you.
Exactly. Let's look at the Ottomans first. They utilized Armenian and Greek financiers known as sarafs to underwrite their imperial treasury.
Which requires immense trust.
It does. They also used Phanaric Greeks, wealthy Greek families, from the Phanar quarter of Istanbul as their chief diplomats, called dragomans.
Oh, right, the polyglots.
Yeah, these dragomans had this incredible polyglot expertise. They spoke Turkish, Greek, Italian, French. The Ottoman state depended on them entirely to navigate trade and treaties with European powers.
And we cannot talk about Ottoman elite incorporation without talking about the Devshirme system. This is one of those historical mechanisms that sounds incredibly harsh to modern ears, but was vital to their statecraft.
It's definitely jarring today.
The Ottomans would take young Christian boys from the Balkans, convert them to Islam, and train them to become the loyal Janissary military class and the highest-ranking viziers in the bureaucracy.
It is a profound psychological and institutional mechanism.
It sounds like kidnapping to build an army.
On the surface, taking children from conquered populations sounds like a recipe for deep resentment. But the Devshirme system was designed to completely sever those boys from their regional, ethnic, and familial loyalties.
So they have nothing else to lean on.
Right. Once incorporated, the Sultan became their only father figure, their only source of wealth, and their only avenue for advancement. It created an artificial meritocracy completely dependent on the center.
That's intense.
They became the ultimate loyalists because they had no alternate power base to fall back on.
That makes perfect sense mechanically. You are manufacturing a class of hyper-competent administrators and soldiers who literally owe their entire existence to the CEO.
Exactly.
Now, the Mughals had their own version of incorporating elites, right? The Mansabdari system.
Yes, the Mansabdari system was the absolute circulatory system of the Mughal Empire. Every military commander, every high-level bureaucrat, every provincial governor was given a mansab, which was a numerical rank.
And what did that rank actually mean?
This rank dictated two things. First, your personal salary, and second, exactly how many armed cavalrymen you were required to maintain for the emperor's use.
And the genius of what Akbar did was that he brought the Rajput nobles, the fiercely independent Hindu warrior elites of Rajasthan, men like Raja Man Singh, straight into the highest echelons of this system.
He integrated his former rivals.
He made them top-tier mansabdars, he made them generals of his armies and governors of his wealthiest provinces. He didn't just conquer them, he made them shareholders in the Mughal enterprise.
He aligned their personal pursuit of glory and wealth entirely with the expansion of the Mughal state. And it wasn't just the military.
Yeah.
The Mughals relied heavily on Hindu scribal castes, specifically the Kayasths and Khatris, to run the entire revenue bureaucracy. The legendary finance minister Todar Mal, who overhauled the entire imperial taxation system, was a Hindu.
I also want to highlight a massive financial mechanism the sources bring up because it completely blew my mind.
The Hindis.
Yes. To fund these massive military campaigns and govern this continent-sized space, the Mughals relied almost entirely on Jain and Marwari bankers, and they used a financial instrument called the hundi.
Ah, the hundi networks. This is a critical piece of the puzzle. A hundi is essentially a bill of exchange or a promissory note.
But explain how this actually works on the ground in the 17th century. Because if the emperor in Agra needs to send a massive amount of cash to pay his army down south in the Deccan,
Right.
or a merchant in Surat needs to buy silk in Bengal, They aren't loading literal tons of silver coins onto ox carts and marching them across thousands of miles of bandit-infested roads, are they?
No, because that would be incredibly slow and wildly dangerous. The physical movement of hard currency was a massive logistical bottleneck.
So what do they do?
This is where the Marwari banking network steps in. These bankers had established an intricate, continent-wide web of familial and caste-based trust.
It's all based on trust.
Entirely. If a merchant in Surat needed to pay a supplier in Bengal, he would deposit silver with a Marwari banker in Surat. The banker would write a hundi-coded piece of paper. The merchant travels to Bengal with just the paper, hands it to the local branch of that same banking family, and they pay out the silver locally.
It is essentially a 17th century cryptographic trust network.
That's a great way to phrase it.
I mean, the paper is worthless to a bandit, but it represents guaranteed liquidity to the banking network.
Precisely. And the Mughal state desperately needed this network. When the provincial governors collected land taxes in copper or silver, they often used these bankers and their hundis to remit the immense wealth securely back to the central treasury in Delhi or Agra.
So they basically outsourced the banking.
The state outsourced its macroeconomic fluid dynamics to a minority religious group.
So what does this all mean? The so what insight here from the Rossi, Demir, and Khan paper is really profound.
It reframes everything.
It does. When we use the word tolerance today, we usually mean it as a fixed moral absolute, a human right. But in the context of these early modern superpowers, tolerance was not a moral essence.
No, not at all.
It was a highly utilitarian, policy-contingent equilibrium.
It was a survival strategy. By giving minorities a tangible stake in the revenue collection, a place in the military hierarchy, and a role in the bureaucracy, both the Ottomans and the Mughals performed an incredible act of political alchemy.
Political alchemy?
Yeah. They took religious difference, which in Europe at the time was causing horrific, century-long wars of religion, and converted it.
Right. They made it work for them.
It stopped being a liability or a source of constant rebellion and became a massive resource that expanded state capacity. Negotiated tolerance was the technology that allowed these empires to scale.
Okay, that is a brilliant system. If Akbar built this highly functional, wealthy, tolerant equilibrium, then something clearly went terribly, terribly wrong to cause the complete and utter collapse of the Mughal Empire.
Something definitely went wrong.
And to understand that transition from peak stability to absolute ruin, we have to look at the work of the late Professor John F. Richards, as highlighted in the Festschrift dedicated to him.
John F. Richards was truly a pioneer. To understand his impact, you have to realize that before his work, there was a strong tendency among historians to view the Mughal Empire as a sort of exotic, loose, patrimonial system.
Meaning what, exactly? Like, what's a patrimonial system?
Meaning they viewed it almost like a giant, continent-spanning protection racket.
Oh, wow.
The older view was that the empire was held together merely by the sheer charisma and military terror of the emperor himself. It was a network of personal loyalties, rather than a system of durable institutions.
So the assumption was that when you got a weak emperor, the protection racket just naturally fell apart. But Richards said, no, look closer.
Exactly. Richards, particularly in his seminal book Mughal Administration in Golconda, challenged that paradigm completely. He spent years deep in the archives looking at the actual granular administrative records.
Digging into the paperwork.
Yeah, the boring tax documents that actually tell the real story.
And he proved they were actually building a modern state, right? But hold on, I have to push back here.
Sure, go ahead.
You just said 10 minutes ago that they were heavily relying on local caste councils, village panchayats, and customary law to rule the countryside.
I did say that.
That sounds exactly like decentralized medieval feudalism to me. How on earth do you square that with Richards claiming they were building a highly centralized, modern administrative state?
That is a very sharp observation.
Yeah.
And it is the absolute crux of Richards' argument. Being a modern state in the 17th century context doesn't mean micromanaging the daily life of every peasant.
So what does it mean?
It means having the institutional capacity to reliably extract resources and project power. Richards demonstrated that layered above those local village councils was a highly complex, centralized, and fiercely mathematical fiscal state.
Mathematical, like they were running spreadsheets.
Basically, yes. Yeah. They had standardized revenue demands across millions of acres. They conducted incredibly detailed land surveys, measuring crop yields field by field.
Wow, field by field.
Yeah. They had a deep, salaried bureaucracy tracking silver flows, hundi exchange rates, and Mansabdar troop counts.
So the decentralization at the village level was actually a feature, not a bug.
Exactly.
It kept the peace locally, allowing the massive bureaucratic machine above it to quietly and efficiently extract the surplus wealth.
Exactly. The Mughals built a vast institutionalized machine for turning agrarian surplus into military power.
Which is terrifyingly efficient.
Therefore, Richards argued, their fall wasn't just about a sudden loss of cultural vitality or a few bad rulers. The collapse of the Mughal Empire was intimately, directly tied to the breakdown of those very specific, mathematically precise fiscal institutions.
Which brings us to Emperor Aurangzeb in the late 17th century.
Ah, grunt.
If Akbar was the architect of tolerance and fiscal integration, Aurangzeb is almost universally painted as the guy who took a sledgehammer to the whole machine. He reversed many of Akbar's foundational policies.
He did.
In 1679, he officially reimposed the jizya tax on non-Muslims. And the sources point out he did this primarily to fund these absolutely massive, endless military campaigns in the Deccan Plateau in southern India.
The Deccan Wars.
And this sparked intense, visceral resentment across the empire.
It is critically important we pause here.
Yep.
The historical debate around Aurangzeb is highly contested, heavily polarized, and incredibly complex.
So we need to tread carefully.
We do. We need to look at it impartially through the lens of our sources, because there are two distinct schools of thought on why he did this and why it broke the empire.
Right, we're not taking sides here. We are diagnosing the failure. What are the two views?
On one side, some scholars look at his policies, which were heavily influenced by orthodox Islamic State practices outlined in the Fatawa al-Amgiri, a massive legal compilation he sponsored.
Okay, so a very strict legal code.
Yes. They look at this as clear evidence of religious zealotry and persecution. They point to the reimposition of the jizya, the documented destruction of certain politically prominent Hindu temples, and his persecution of Shia Muslims and Sufi mystics.
So a total shift from Akbar's midnight debates.
Exactly. This school of thought argues that Aurangzeb's personal bigotry directly alienated the Rajput, Maratha, and Sikh populations, fundamentally shredding the social contract of Sulikul that Akbar had so carefully built.
He broke the negotiated tolerance, and the incorporated elites walked away. That makes sense. But there is another angle to this, right? One that focuses less on his religious ideology and more on the pure economics of his reign.
Yes. Historians like Irfan Habib argue that the core issue was not purely religious orthodoxy, but extreme, unsustainable economic exploitation.
Meaning they just tax people to death.
Basically. Habib points out that the Mughal elite, desperate for revenue to fund these unending, grinding wars in the Deccan, began squeezing the peasantry relentlessly. The tax demands went up and up.
To pay for the armies.
Right. Habib argues that this excessive exploitation stripped away the people's will and their literal means to support the regime. In this view, the empire did not fall because it stopped being tolerant.
Why did it fall then?
It fell because its foundation collapsed under the weight of its own insatiable greed and fiscal overreach.
Let's talk about that fiscal overreach, because the sheer cost of those Deccan Wars is mind-boggling. I want to read a specific statistic from the source material that just stopped me in my tracks.
I think I know which one you're going to read.
The historian Stanley Wolpert describes Aurangzeb's moving capital during this 27-year-long war in the south. Picture this in your mind. The emperor did not just send an army, he moved his entire court.
The whole thing.
His administration, his harem, everything. It became a city of tents that was 30 miles in circumference.
30 miles. It is almost unimaginable logistics.
Wolpert notes it had 250 separate bazaars just to supply it. It contained 500,000 camp followers, 50,000 camels, and 30,000 elephants. It is staggering.
It really is. Try to visualize the sheer caloric intake required to keep 500,000 people, 50,000 camels, and 30,000 elephants alive every single day in an arid plateau.
I was trying to come up with an analogy for this. Initially, I thought it's like a massive modern corporation acquiring a rival, but the integration process takes 30 years and bankrupts the parent company.
That's pretty good.
But that doesn't capture the physical devastation. It is more like a giant parasitic cruise ship that has somehow dragged itself onto dry land.
Oh, that's a disturbing image.
It is 30 miles wide, it holds 500,000 passengers, and it just slowly grinds its way across the landscape, forcing the local farmers to feed it until the land itself is completely and utterly stripped bare of every single resource.
That is a much more accurate, visceral analogy. And if we connect this parasitic cruise ship back to John F. Richards' focus on state finance, we see exactly why it was fatal.
Because it just ate everything.
Yes. The Deccan conquest was the ultimate Pyrrhic victory. To feed that 30-mile-wide city of tents for nearly 3 decades, they stripped peninsular India of all its surplus grain and wealth.
The sources mention that it caused devastating regional famines. And because everyone was starving and immune systems were compromised, bubonic plague broke out in the camps and the surrounding countryside.
It was an ecological and human disaster. And the financial drain on the imperial treasury was absolute.
They spent it all.
Think back to that negotiated tolerance we discussed earlier. Negotiated tolerance requires surplus wealth to function.
Oh, because you need to pay everyone off.
Exactly. You can remit taxes, pay massive salaries to Rajput generals, and buy the loyalty of local elites when the treasury is full. But when the treasury is empty, and you are bogged down in a 27-year war of attrition, you can't buy loyalty anymore.
You just have to demand it.
You have to squeeze everyone just to survive another month. The utilitarian equilibrium fell apart completely under the sheer fiscal strain.
Even Aurangzeb seemed to realize the scale of the disaster at the very end. The source notes that in 1707, nearing the age of 90, lying on his deathbed after a lifetime of war, he confessed to his son in a letter.
It's a very famous letter.
He wrote, "I came alone and I go as a stranger. I do not know who I am nor what I have been doing." That is a haunting admission from an absolute monarch.
It really is. It is the realization of a man who spent his life expanding an empire only to realize he had hollowed out its core. And his death in 1707 kicks off the next phase of our deep dive, the internal collapse.
Because with the treasury totally empty and the strongman emperor dead, the empire's internal structural integrity was immediately put to the ultimate test. And the result was brutal, immediate fracturing.
You immediately get wars of succession. Not just one localized dispute, but a series of massive, empire-shaking civil wars.
Brother against brother.
Let's look at the immediate aftermath in 1707. Aurangzeb's 3 sons, Bahadur Shah, Muhammad Azam Shah, and Muhammad Kambash, immediately turned their armies on each other.
It is a literal race to the capital city of Agra to seize the treasury. The historian Kafi Khan notes that whoever reached Agra first would capture the throne.
It was a sprint.
Azam Shah and Bahadur Shah clash at the massive Battle of Jajau in June 1707. Azam Shah and his 3 sons are killed on the battlefield.
And the victor, Bahadur Shah, doesn't even get to rest.
No, he doesn't.
He then has to march his exhausted army all the way down to Hyderabad in the south to defeat his other brother, Kambash, in 1709.
Which is thousands of miles away.
Think about the logistics of that. It is a massive expenditure of blood, resources, and the very last scraps of treasure just to secure the physical throne. And while Babur Shah tries to reverse some of his father's harshest policies, he is an old man himself, and he dies in 1712.
And then the chaos really accelerates into overdrive. The source notes a statistic that tells you everything you need to know about the stability of the center. In the year 1719 alone, 4 different emperors successively ascended the Mughal throne.
It's absurd.
4 emperors in a single calendar year.
This is where we see the total breakdown of imperial authority. The throne is no longer the center of power. We see the rise of powerful noble factions, most notably the Sayyid brothers, Hassan Ali Khan and Hussein Ali Khan.
The kingmakers.
Yes, they belonged to the Saadati Bar clan and were influential generals. But after Aurangzeb's death, they realized the emperors were weak, and they essentially became the kingmakers.
They became the de facto sovereigns. But how does that actually work mechanically? How do 2 generals just decide to swap out emperors?
Through control of the military bureaucracy and strategic alliances. They would back a claimant to the throne, use their troops to eliminate his rivals, and then install him.
Just pop him on the throne.
But the moment that emperor tried to assert his own independent authority or cut the Sayyid brothers out of the revenue stream, they would literally march on the palace, blind him or kill him, and pull another prince out of the royal harem to replace him.
That is so deeply cynical.
It was. For instance, they helped Farrukhsher defeat his rival Bahadur Shah. But when Farrukhsher tried to govern independently, in 1719, the Sayyid brothers marched on Delhi with an army that included Maratha allies.
Wait, the Marathas, the supposed enemies of the state.
Exactly. They used the enemy to attack their own emperor. They deposed Farrukhsher, blinded him, and installed a sickly teenager, Rafi-ud-Darajat. The power had completely shifted. The emperor was a hostage in his own palace.
And while the center in Delhi is busy eating itself alive with these palace coups, the provinces realize no one is steering the ship. The peripheries explode into rebellion.
They smell blood on the water.
Let's talk about the Rajputs first. These were the same Hindu warrior elites that Akbar had so carefully brought into the inner circle with the Mansabdari system. But that trust had been shattered.
You see a complete fracture of that elite incorporation model. It started when Aurangzeb tried to interfere with the succession of the Rajput estate of Marwar in 1679.
Overstepping his bounds.
And he reportedly tried to force the infant Rajput prince Ajit Singh to convert to Islam. The Rajputs had had enough. Nobles like Durgadas Rathore and Ajit Singh engage in grueling, decades-long guerrilla warfare against the Mughals.
And even after Aurangzeb dies, it doesn't stop. Bahadur Shah Zafar tries to invade Marwar again, which leads directly to the massive Rajput rebellion of 1708 to 1710.
They push too hard.
The major Rajput houses form an alliance, Ajit Singh, Amar Singh II, Maharaja Singh II, and they hand the imperial Mughal armies severe, humiliating defeat.
But yet at Sampar.
Yes, at the Battle of Sampar, they killed 3,000 Mughal soldiers, and brilliantly, they captured the imperial treasury camp and distributed the wealth directly to their own people.
It is a devastating blow to Mughal prestige. The center eventually has to sue for peace and offer these Rajput kings high-level governorships, just to quiet things down.
Just throwing titles at them to make it stop.
But the Rajputs are just one front. The Marathas, down in the Deccan, are an entirely different existential level of threat.
The Maratha Empire, founded by the legendary warrior Shivaji, becomes the great nemesis of the later Mughals. And Shivaji was audacious.
Very audacious.
Decades earlier, in 1665, he executes a lightning raid and sacks Surat. Surat was a massively wealthy Mughal port city, the primary departure point for the Hajj pilgrimage, and a hub of global trade.
It was the jewel of their trade network.
He raids it and takes cash, gold, silver, rubies, and diamonds from the incredibly rich merchants.
It proved that the Mughal military could not protect its most vital economic assets. And after Aurangzeb's death, the Marathas don't just raid, they aggressively, systematically expand.
The numbers in the sources highlight how dramatic this expansion was. In 1713, Shahu, who is Shivaji's recognized heir, appoints a man named Balaji Vishwanath as his Peshwa.
Which is essentially the prime minister.
Then Balaji's son, Bajirao I, takes over. Bajirao I is an absolute military genius. He is credited with expanding the Maratha Empire tenfold. They went from controlling just 3% of the Indian landscape to 30% between 1720 and 1740.
The tactical shift is what's crucial here. How did they defeat the Mughals so consistently?
The source says Bajirao I fought over 41 major battles and never lost a single one. Not one. How is that mechanically possible against an empire that had 30,000 war elephants?
Because of asymmetric warfare. The Mughal armies were still operating like that 30-mile-wide parasitic cruise ship we talked about.
Slow and heavy.
They were slow, heavily armored, weighed down by massive baggage trains and artillery that was hard to move. The Marathas, under Bajirao I, utilized highly mobile light cavalry.
So they just ran rings around them?
They didn't have massive supply lines. They lived off the land. They would execute lightning strikes, cut the Mughal supply, burn the forge so the mobile horses and elephants starved.
Oh, that's brutal.
And then vanish before the heavy Mughal artillery could even be positioned.
In 1737, Bajirao executes a blitzkrieg raid right into the suburbs of Delhi itself, terrifying the emperor, and leaves before the main Mughal army can catch him. It is a total paradigm shift in military dominance.
Completely.
And it culminates decades later. By 1784, a later Maratha leader, Mahadaji Shinde, literally marches into Delhi, captures it, and installs the Mughal Emperor Shah Alam II as a puppet ruler under Maratha protection.
Think about the irony of that.
The Marathas actually give Shinde the Mughal title of Amir-ul-Amara, head of the emirs. The Mughal emperor is essentially taking orders in his own palace from the people his great-grandfather spent 27 years and the entire imperial treasury trying to destroy.
It is a stunning, complete reversal of fortune. And yet we haven't even touched on the Sikhs yet.
Right in the Punjab region, which is the agricultural heartland right in the Mughals' backyard. It's right on the road to Central Asia.
The transition of the Sikh community during this period is incredible.
Tell me about it.
They start as a largely peaceful religious community. Then, under Guru Hargobind in the early 17th century, they form the Akal Sena, the Immortal Army, and start fighting localized skirmishes to protect themselves. But the tipping point comes with Aurangzeb.
It usually does.
Yes. In 1675, Aurangzeb orders the execution of the 9th Sikh Guru, Guru Tegh Bahadur. He is publicly beheaded in Delhi for refusing to convert to Islam and for protecting Kashmiri Hindus.
Wow.
This act of state violence permanently changes the trajectory of Sikh history.
It militarizes the community entirely. Guru Gobind Singh formalizes the Khalsa order in 1699, creating the Khalsa Fauj. This is not a ragtag militia. This is a highly organized, deeply motivated, egalitarian military force.
And under leaders like Banda Singh Bahadur, they go on the offensive. They establish the first Sikh state, capturing the major Mughal city of Sirhind in 1710 and minting their own coins.
Minting coins is a huge declaration of independence.
It's the ultimate sign of sovereignty. The Mughals eventually capture and execute Banda Singh Bahadur, but the Sikhs just reorganize. They form the Dal Khalsa, which is a combined, unified military force made up of 11 different Sikh missiles or bands.
And here is perhaps the most visually striking cinematic moment of this entire internal collapse. In 1783, Sikh forces under leaders like Jasas Singh Ramgarhia ride right into Delhi. They capture the Red Fort.
The Red Fort, the absolute symbolic heart of Mughal imperial power.
Yes. And they do not just raid the treasury, they walk into the Diwaniyam, the hall of public audience, and they literally detach the Mughal throne.
They steal the throne itself.
They tie the marble slab of the throne to horses and elephants and drag it all the way away to Amritsar. You cannot ask for a more potent, humiliating symbol of an empire entirely losing its grip on its own symbols of power.
If we connect this all back to the bigger picture of how large organizations fail, there's a fascinating paradox here that historians like John F. Richards point out.
Heard up.
The profound irony is that the earlier economic success and stability of the Mughal Empire under Akbar and Jahangir actually created very wealthy, powerful, and culturally cohesive provinces.
That is wild. The empire essentially funded and built the infrastructure for its own replacements.
Exactly. Because the Mughal state had standardized taxation, built roads, and encouraged agriculture, provinces like Bengal, Awadh, and the Punjab became incredibly wealthy.
And then what happened?
Once the central Mughal authority in Delhi showed weakness, exhausted by the Deccan Wars, bogged down in succession crises, and financially ruined, these regional powers realized they didn't need the center anymore.
They were self-sufficient.
The Rajputs, the Marathas, the Sikhs, the provincial Nawabs, they had both the motive to rebel and the immense regional wealth and organizational capacity to actually break away and govern themselves. The center couldn't hold because the periphery had simply become too strong.
Okay, so let's take stock of where we are. We have an empire that is bankrupt. The emperor is a puppet being swapped out by his own generals. The borders are shrinking rapidly as the Marathas and Sikhs carve out massive independent states, and the capital has been repeatedly raided.
It's a grim picture.
Which brings us to part 4 of our deep dive. External blows. Because in geopolitics, a bleeding, internally fractured empire is like blood in the water. It attracts apex predators from the outside.
And the most devastating of those apex predators arrived in 1739. Nader Shah of Persia, the founder of the Afsharid dynasty and one of the most brilliant, ruthless military commanders in Asian history.
Nader Shah sees the chaos in India, marches a battle-hardened Persian army through the Khyber Pass, and heads straight for the immense wealth of Delhi.
A direct strike.
Emperor Muhammad Shah manages to scrape together a massive Mughal army and meets him at the Battle of Karnal in February 1739. This battle, as detailed in our sources, is a masterclass in how a once great military institution completely fails to adapt to modern warfare.
The tactical mismatch here is crucial to understand. It wasn't just that the Mughals were internally weak. Their military culture had stagnated for decades.
They were stuck in the past.
Their cavalry, led by high-ranking nobles like the commander Khan Dauran, consisted largely of aristocrats who prided themselves on traditional warfare. They valued swordsmanship, archery, and fancy equestrian skills.
Like knights in shining armor.
Exactly. They actively looked down on firearms. They considered muskets to be the cowardly weapon of low-class infantrymen.
It is the classic trap of past success blinding you to technological shifts. Meanwhile, Nader Shah brings a deeply modernized, gunpowder-heavy army. He's using Jazairs, which are these massive, heavy, armor-piercing muskets, and he brings Zamburiks.
The Zamburiks were the definitive game changer.
Explain what a Zamburik is, because the visual is insane.
The Zamburik is a swivel cannon mounted on the saddle of a camel. So you have highly mobile, relatively accurate light artillery that can be repositioned across the battlefield in minutes, firing continuously into the enemy lines.
Camels with cannons.
Literally, camels with cannons.
Nader Shah deploys these against the traditional pride of the Mughal army, the war elephants. And it is an absolute slaughter. The Persian camel artillery and heavy muskets easily pierce the thick armor of the Mughal war elephants.
Which causes a chain reaction of disaster.
Exactly, because an armored war elephant is basically a medieval tank, and it is terrifying until it gets hit in the face with a cannonball. Then it panics, goes completely feral, turns around, and furiously tramples its own army in an effort to escape the noise and the pain.
It's the worst-case scenario.
Which is exactly what happened at Karnal. The Mughal front lines were crushed by their own panicked beasts. The Mughal commander, Khan Daran, is mortally wounded, falling from his elephant covered in his own blood.
It's total chaos.
Another top commander, Saadat Khan, literally has his elephant get tangled up with another panicked elephant, and he is forced to surrender when a Persian soldier just climbs up the side of his trapped elephant and captures him.
The tactical stubbornness was fatal. The Mughals lost an estimated 10,000 to 20,000 men in a single day, including 400 top officers, largely because they refused to adapt their tactics and technology to the gunpowder age.
That is a staggering loss of life.
Emperor Muhammad Shah has absolutely no choice but to surrender the keys to the royal treasury to Nader Shah.
And the fierce scale of the plunder during the sacking of Delhi is hard to wrap your head around. Nader Shah marches into Delhi, a localized riot breaks out, and Nader Shah orders a general massacre.
A horrific event.
But it is the financial extraction that truly breaks the empire's back. They loot the city for days, they pry gold off the walls of palaces, they take an estimated 700 million rupees worth of treasure.
A staggering, economy-breaking sum.
To move it, they load the booty onto thousands of elephants, horses, and camels. Nader Shah takes the legendary peacock throne encrusted with jewels, which forever after becomes the symbol of Persian imperial might.
He took their most prized possessions.
He takes the Koh-i-Noor diamond, the mountain of light. He takes the Darya-i-Noor, the sea of light. The plunder was so vast, so incredibly wealthy, that when Nader Shah returned to Persia, he issued a decree stopping taxation across his entire Persian empire for 3 full years.
Think about that.
I can't. 3 years! He funded his entire empire with the stolen wealth of Delhi.
It was a fatal hemorrhage. The Mughal state was already bankrupt, and Nader Shah essentially ripped out whatever copper wiring was left in the walls. And the bleeding didn't stop there.
There was more.
Because once Nader Shah showed the world that Delhi was defenseless, others followed. Shortly after, you have the repeated Afghan invasions led by Ahmad Shah Durrani.
Right. Durrani invades India multiple times in the mid-18th century. He captures Lahore. He fights the Mughals at the Battle of Manipur.
And even though the Mughals technically hold him off there, the details show how chaotic their military was.
Yeah, literally a Mughal rocket cart caught fire by accident and ignited the Afghan artillery store, causing a massive explosion. But the Afghans still inflicted catastrophic damage and raided the countryside.
Durrani repeatedly raids, extorts, and massacres. And to survive these constant incursions, the Mughal court is reduced to making desperate, humiliating alliances.
Like with who?
They had to ask the Marathas, the same Marathas who had just spent decades dismantling their empire, and the Sikhs to protect Delhi from the Afghans. They are outsourcing their own survival to the very rebels who broke them.
So just to clarify the reality on the ground at this point, after the internal rebellions, Nader Shah taking the treasury and Ahmad Shah Durrani constantly raiding, the Mughal emperor is basically just a mayor of Delhi, right?
Yeah.
And a weak mayor at that.
That is a very accurate assessment of their geopolitical standing. They were ruling in name only. The emperor sat on a wooden throne because the peacock throne was gone.
That's just sad.
They were effectively vassals, puppets dancing on the strings of whoever happened to hold the strongest army outside the Red Fort that week, be it the Marathas, the Afghans, the British, or their own rebellious Nawabs. The majestic imperial superstructure that Akbar built was entirely, completely hollowed out.
Which perfectly sets the stage for our final act. Because the final predator to strike the killing blow, the entity that actually scoops up the remains of this continent-spanning superpower, wasn't a rival king.
No, it wasn't.
It wasn't an invading nomadic horde. It was a joint stock company, the British East India Company.
This is a highly unusual and deeply consequential phase of global history. European colonialism in India did not begin with massive national armies conquering the continent in the name of the crown.
It began with a corporation.
It began with mercantile companies, capitalizing on the fractured, chaotic, decentralized landscape we just spent the last hour describing.
Right. The British and the French are down in the south fighting proxy wars, known as the Carnatic Wars. But they aren't fighting the Mughal emperor directly. They are backing rival local Nawabs.
And these Nawabs were provincial governors who had, in the wake of Delhi's collapse, basically declared themselves independent kings.
The European companies are acting as heavily armed mercenaries and regional kingmakers. They use their highly drilled sepoy infantry and superior European field artillery to tip the scales in local Indian civil wars.
And in return for winning these battles, they don't just ask for cash. They demand exclusive trade concessions and territorial rights.
Here is where the diagnostic X-ray gets really interesting and a bit terrifying. Let's look at the Battle of Plassey in 1757 in Bengal. Robert Clive, who is an employee of the British East India Company, leads their forces against the Nawab of Bengal, Siraj-ud-Dowlah, and his French allies.
A critical turning point.
But Clive doesn't win this battle through brilliant tactical maneuvering or overwhelming military force.
No, he wins through subversion and corporate bribery.
Exactly. It is essentially a leveraged buyout of a hostile competitor. Clive secretly contacts Mir Jafar, who is the Nawab's own commander-in-chief of the army. Clive bribes him.
Straight up bribery.
He promises Mir Jafar that if he holds his troops back during the battle and lets the British win, the company will make Mir Jafar the new Nawab. The battle happens, Mir Jafar's troops refuse to fight, Siraj-ud-Dowlah is defeated and subsequently murdered, and the British East India Company effectively takes control of Bengal.
They bought the military out from under him.
And they extract massive financial restitutions from Mir Jafar's new government. Millions of rupees in coin and jewels straight into the company's vaults.
They realized that military conflict is expensive and unpredictable. But buying the opponent's board of directors, exploiting the internal fracture lines of a decaying state is highly efficient.
It's corporate warfare.
And then, 7 years later, comes the true death knell of Mughal sovereignty, the Battle of Buxar in 1764.
At Buxar, the British East India Company, led by Hector Munro with an army of just over 17,000 troops, faces off against a combined massive Indian army.
A huge coalition force.
It is the Nawab of Bengal, Mir Qasim, the Nawab of Awadh, Shah-Jahan, and the Mughal Emperor himself, Shah Alam II. This is the last stand of the old powers, and the British absolutely rout them.
The Battle of Buxar exposed the inherent fatal weaknesses and the complete lack of unity among the Indian rulers. They did not trust each other, their command structures were divided, and when the battle turned, it became every man for himself.
It fell apart under pressure.
The Grand Vizier of Awadh actually blew up his own boat bridge across the river while retreating, deliberately abandoning the Mughal emperor to the British just to save his own skin.
Unbelievable.
Shah Alam II has no army left. He is forced to negotiate from a position of absolute defeat. And the result is the Treaty of Allahabad in 1765.
I want to spend a minute on this treaty because it is structurally fascinating. The British force Shah Alam II to grant them Diwani rights. I want you to break down exactly what that means, because why didn't they just conquer it and claim it for England?
This is the genius of the corporate takeover. The British East India Company didn't want the responsibility of governing the everyday lives of the people or dispensing religious justice. They wanted the revenue.
Show me the money.
Diwani rights gave the company the legal imperial right to collect land revenue, to collect taxes directly from the people of the immensely wealthy provinces of Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. And legally, they were doing it on behalf of the Mughal emperor.
Oh, that is so sneaky. Hold on, we are just your humble tax collectors, Your Majesty. We will collect millions of pounds in taxes, remit a tiny fixed pension to you in Delhi, and keep the massive surplus to fund our private armies.
It is the ultimate hostile takeover.
The corporate entity doesn't just buy your assets or defeat your security team. They legally acquire the right to tax your own citizens, and then they use that tax money to fund their own further expansion across your territory.
It gave a private, profit-driven corporation immense, unquestioned economic control over the wealthiest province in all of India. And this is where we absolutely must connect back to the broader thesis of Professor John F. Richards from the Festschrift we discussed earlier.
The book Expanding Frontiers in South Asian and World History.
Yes. Richards' work expanded beyond just the internal administrative mechanics of the Mughals to look at how they fit into global trade networks.
How does that tie in?
Chapters in that tribute book, particularly the essays by scholars like Stephen F. Dale and Claude Markovitz, detail exactly how the British East India Company utilized this newly acquired vast Indian tax wealth. They didn't just hoard the silver in Calcutta or send it all back to London.
What do they do with it?
They used it to fuel a sprawling global maritime empire.
Specifically, they used the revenue extracted from former Mughal lands in Bengal to fund the political economy of opium smuggling.
Exactly. They forced Bengali farmers to grow opium, They used the Diwani tax revenues to buy that opium at artificially low prices.
So they basically stole the harvest.
Then they shipped that opium to Canton and smuggled it into China to illegally buy tea and silk and sent it to Java. The local institutional collapse of the Mughal fiscal state directly subsidized the creation of a massive global British imperial economy.
And all connected.
The wealth of the Indian subcontinent was repurposed by a foreign corporation to manipulate and dominate global commodity markets.
It's just wild. The scale of the transfer of wealth and power is almost dizzying. Which brings us to our outro and the final tragic gasp of the Mughal Empire. Because technically, the empire didn't end in 1765 at Buxar.
It didn't.
It lingered on as a hollow, ghostly shell for nearly another century until the massive 1857 Indian Rebellion against the British East India Company.
Yes. By 1857, the emperor, Bahadur Shah Zafar, is an 81-year-old man who writes poetry and has zero real political or military power. He is a pensioner of the British.
He's just a figurehead.
When the Indian sepoys, the Indian soldiers employed by the British rebel, they marched to Delhi and essentially forced this elderly poet to be the figurehead of their mutiny.
They need his name for legitimacy, even though he has no power. But the British brutally crushed the rebellion, and the imagery of the very end is so bleak, so heavy with historical irony.
It really is.
After the brutal siege and sack of Delhi by the British, Zafar flees the Red Fort and takes refuge in Humayun's tomb, which is incredibly ironic because nearly 150 years earlier, that is the exact location where his ancestors, Azam Shah and his sons, were buried after the very first succession war we talked about at the Battle of Jajau in 1707.
It is a grim, full circle of decline.
Major William Hodson, a British cavalry officer, discovers him there and forces his surrender. And the very next day, to ensure there could be no future rallying figure for the Mughal dynasty, Hodson personally shoots Zafar's two sons and his grandson at point-blank range at the Kuni Darwaza, the Blood Gate in Delhi.
A brutal end to the bloodline.
And the last Mughal emperor, Bahadur Shah Zafar, is deposed, put on trial for treason by the very company that had been legally acting as his tax collector, loaded onto a bullock cart at 4 a.m. to avoid crowds, and exiled to Rangoon, Burma, where he dies in obscurity.
An incredibly sad end.
The empire is formally, legally dead, and the British government steps in, dissolves the East India Company, and replaces it directly with the British crown, beginning the British Raj.
So, to summarize this epic, sprawling journey for you, listening today, the Mughal Empire didn't just fall overnight from a single blow. It was an absolute masterpiece of institutional design.
Truly a marvel.
It was a marvel of negotiated tolerance, complex legal pluralism, and deep fiscal administration. But it was slowly, methodically undone from the inside out.
Undone by its own success, in a way.
It was undone by massive military overreach in the Deccan, by the complete fiscal bankruptcy that inevitably followed, by a stubborn technological stagnation on the battlefield against Nader Shah, and by the privatization of power to regional warlords.
It was a towering skyscraper that swayed perfectly in the winds of diversity for generations until the internal structural bolts rusted away through greed and overexpansion, and it collapsed under its own weight, leaving the rubble to be scooped up, monetized, and outsourced by foreign corporate merchants.
That's a great way to put it.
And that leaves us with a final thought for you to mull over. We have seen how the British East India Company weaponized the economic instability of a massive empire to stage a literal corporate takeover of a subcontinent.
A chilling historical fact.
Look at the massive multinational corporations of today. The tech giants, the global financial conglomerates, the logistics monopolies, whose revenues completely dwarf the GDP of many modern nations. They have their own internal laws, their own global logistics networks, their own private intelligence.
They are essentially modern empires.
If a global power structure were to fracture tomorrow due to internal strain, climate migration, or massive financial exhaustion, who really has the capital, the networks, and the institutional capacity to step in and collect the taxes of the 21st century?
Would a fractured nation simply rebuild?
Or would a company step into the void and take the ultimate Diwani rights? Something to chew on as you look at that diagnostic X-ray of our own muddy waters. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.